Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to another installment of A Date with Darkness podcast. Super excited to be chatting with you all today. And of course, I have another wonderful guest interview planned for today. And of course, as you know, like to get the administrative stuff out of the way. And if you have a question about the podcast or a concern or a comment, you could certainly send that over to hello@drnataliejones.com. If you are interested in getting on the mailing list to receive a copy of the newsletter that I send out every Friday morning, you can go over to drnataliejones.com and hit the sign up list. Right now we have the ebook, Noticing Red Flags in Your Relationships, and that is a checklist that you would want to go through to see if you have red flags in your relationships. And of course, as always, you know that we've got the individual and group membership opening, so please make sure that you sign up down below if you want to be in the know and see some of the behind the scenes stuff that we're working on. And if you like what you hear, or you find it informative, or you think that someone else could benefit from listening to a particular episode or this show in general, please do spread the awareness and share, like, and make sure you leave a positive comment on iTunes. Therefore, it goes across all platforms so that people can easily find the show and know and look and see what you enjoy hearing about it. And I appreciate that. So, of course, I'd like to talk about something very near and dear. And of course, we've covered a number of topics as of late as it pertains to unhealthy relationships. And today I have a very special guest planned for today that is an expert on self-compassion. The idea behind doing a show around self-compassion is I think self-compassion and compassion in general are one of those things that when someone is in an abusive relationship, or they're kind of they may be leaving and going back, or just experiencing the cycle of violence that is very common when you're in an abusive relationships. Um, People often get down on themselves for going back. Victims of abuse are often caught in a cycle for whatever the reason may be. The reason may be financial. It might be that they can't. They're trauma bonded. It might be that we have children together, or it's challenging. There's some other challenges, or dynamic in abusive relationships, which you may not be aware of. And it's very hard to break that cycle. It's when you're sort of caught up in that and you start to feel embarrassed, you start to feel ashamed, you start to talk negatively to yourself about being in a relationship that is hurtful in every way and that breaks down your spirit. It's almost like you inherit the abuser's voice towards yourself, if that makes sense. That you have this low self-esteem, low self-worth. And if you have other outside forces that may also be confirming that, or saying, I told you so, or why would you do that, or people demonstrating or saying in other ways that they don't really have respect for you because you're in an abusive relationship that is a very hard dynamic to break sometimes, and it's very overwhelming to listen to that, and it almost reinforces, it does reinforce the blame on the victim who's experiencing the abuse or the toxicity in the relationship. And it does nothing to help them get out or find better. So I thought that by chatting with our guests today, we could break down what self-compassion is, how we do it, why it's important for us to have it, and how it can help us thrive instead of survive in our relationships. So, who better to talk about self compassion than the expert on self compassion herself, Dr. Kristen Neff? And I'm super excited to have Dr. Neff up here today. She is a guru of all things self compassion. And I love the way that she eloquently breaks it down and talks about how, it's not a privilege, it's not something that it's going to overwhelm you, and it's absolutely a necessity for you to have a better quality of life, to have better quality relationships. And, even just to get through the day sometimes, no one knows your struggle. Um, and so that's very challenging. And so Dr. Neff is definitely a breath of fresh air in talking about why we need to have self compassion as an everyday regular practice. It definitely needs to be put in our hat for things that are going to help us get through this and so much more. And she also shares her journey with self compassion as well. So here's my interview with Dr. Neff. Hello, Dr. Kristen Neff. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Dr. Natalie. How are you?
I'm doing fabulous now. I'm super excited that you could join us today for today's podcast. So, could you, for the listeners who are just tuning in, can you tell us who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work?
Yeah, so I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And what I do is I study self-compassion. I study and teach self-compassion. I have been for over 20 years now. And it really is my life's calling to spread the word, spread the good word, so to speak, of the amazing difference it makes in our mental health and our ability to be strong and get through difficulty if we actually relate to our suffering with kindness and support. Passion in the Latin means to suffer. So it's basically, how are we with the tough stuff? Are we shaming ourselves? Are we slamming ourselves? Are we being cold to ourselves? Or are we being like a warm, supportive friend to ourselves? And the research shows that if we're the latter, it makes a huge difference. Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became so passionate about self-compassion? What was it that said, I really want to take a deeper dive into this?
Yeah, well, for me, it's all about personal practice. It actually came first. I mean, so I certainly didn't invent the idea of self-compassion. I learned about it in my last year of graduate school at UC Berkeley.
Nice.
It's about 95, so a long time ago. And I was a mess. I had just gotten a divorce. It was a messy divorce. I was feeling like shame and just feeling like a failure. And I was also feeling a lot of stress about, after I get my PhD, would I get a job? There were absolutely no guarantees. And so I learned mindfulness meditation. And I learned mindfulness in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Zen master, recently passed, who always talked about the importance of shining the light of compassion inward as well as outward. And so as I was learning mindfulness meditation, which took a little while, I actually tried being kind and supportive to myself toward everything I was feeling, the stress I was feeling, the kind of messiness of my life. And I was just so impressed by the immediate difference it made in my ability to cope. Like the mindfulness meditation took a while to figure out what to do, how to do it. But like the moment I shifted my attitude toward myself to one of support and friendliness, as opposed to just shame and blame, it made a huge difference in my ability to cope. And so then eventually when I did get a job at UT Austin, I decided I wanted to research it and kind of prove to the world its benefits. Which has happened. So that's great. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, as a self-compassion guru and expert, are there days where your self-compassion falters for yourself?
Not really.
Okay.
There are days when I feel shame. There are days when I lose it. There are days I'm still a mess. I'm still a very flawed human being. So that part of it,
Yes.
it's maybe improved a little after 20 years of practice, but not a whole lot. Not as much as you might hope it would. But it's really become, so it's not natural to me at this point to be harsh with myself. Right. And it's interesting, it's like the feeling of shame, this is an evolved emotion. We don't actually
Yeah.
control whether or not that arises. So
Mm.
feelings of like, let's say I'm reactive and, and I feel badly about it. The feeling of shame comes up. It's a natural emotion. But instead of running away with the storyline of, oh, I'm so terrible and you should just hang it all in and you're a fraud or whatever it is that might come up, I just feel it. Sometimes, sometimes I do it more explicitly than others. Sometimes I remember, okay, what you need, Kristen, is to put your hand on your heart and say, this is really hard. You tried the best you can. You didn't do it intentionally. It's okay. I'm here for you. So sometimes I have to remind myself to do it explicitly. But what's kind of left me is the shame and blame. Again, the shame arises, but the identification with the shame that, I might feel shame, but it doesn't mean that I'm a horrible person. This is just a feeling that is arising and passing away. I don't create a storyline anymore about that means I'm a bad person.
I like
That's
that.
huge.
I
It
like
doesn't
that.
stick. It's not sticky. It's like, is shame sticky or not? Self-compassion makes shame not stick.
Good.
It's like Teflon spray or whatever. It's like non-stick spray for a pan, just spray it on yourself.
Can you tell us what self-compassion is?
Right. Yeah. So, the easy way to understand it, like I mentioned, is how we're with our suffering. Are we friendly? Are we supportive? But actually, when I decided I wanted to research it, I knew I had to develop a theoretical model of what it is, because I wanted to measure it. And I created a scale to measure it and started researching it. So for my model, it has three main components. Again, the most obvious is the kindness, the warmth, the support. But two other elements really need to be there to make this a healthy mindset. One is mindfulness. So we need to be able to be aware when we're struggling or we're feeling difficult emotions in a balanced way. So that means we don't ignore it. We don't stuff it down. Imagine if a friend called you and said, I'm really upset. I need to talk. You're like, I don't have time.
Yeah.
We do that with ourselves. Just like grit and bear it. Just say, suck it up. So it's not that we don't ignore it, but neither do we do the opposite extreme of wallowing in it, like where we just get totally lost in the storyline or the drama or the difficulty. It's like we're aware. That's what mindfulness gives us, the ability to be aware of what's happening as it's happening.
Yes.
With a little space and distance. And that's actually the first step of self-compassion. We need to relate mindfully to our discomfort, whether it's emotional or a physical, to respond with kindness. And then as I was kind of thinking about what went into it, I realized I was really concerned with the question, what's the difference between self-compassion and self-pity, or feeling sorry for yourself? Because we know that feeling sorry for ourselves isn't very useful, right?
I agree.
So one is the mindfulness. When we feel sorry for ourselves, we're just lost in it. But really important is other people. So the difference between compassion and pity. If I pity you, I'm looking down on you. I feel sorry for you. You probably aren't going to like it if I pity you. But if I have compassion for you, it's like, oh, I've been there. We're all human. It's a connected way of relating to others. And the same with self-compassion. It's a connected way of relating to our own difficulty. So, I'm human, I'm flawed, all human beings are flawed, all human beings struggle. And by the way, it doesn't mean that some people do struggle more than others. We don't want to say like, we're all one or we're all the same, absolutely. People with privilege suffer less than people who are oppressed. People with a trauma history suffer more than people who had like a happy, secure family. So it doesn't deny the reality of difference in the amount or type of suffering. But what it does do is say, this is our humanity. Every human being has the right to compassion. When a baby is born, it's like, we don't say, okay, once you get a graduate degree, then you'll be worthy of compassion. It's like, it's an intrinsic part of being human. And this is something that we all share. And the state of imperfection is something we all share, again, to a greater or lesser degree, but this is actually what defines us as human beings. So what distinguishes self-compassion from self-pity is just the humanness of it. We relate to ourselves as human beings who are connected to other human beings. We see ourselves and our situation as part of the larger whole. We're part of this larger fabric of society and culture and history and, causes and conditions. It's a much bigger view. And by embedding our relation to our difficulties in this larger picture, first of all, it gives us wisdom. It's really what it offers is wisdom. And it helps us feel not so alone. One of the worst parts of the way we normally relate to ourselves is we feel like I'm the only one who's ever failed. Or I'm the only one who's gotten this disease. Or we know logically that's not true, but we feel as if it's true. And it's like we're kicking ourselves when we're down, because not only are we hurting, we feel isolated and abnormal because we're hurting. And so with self-compassion, we remember, hey, this is just part of being human. And then that kind of embeds our pain in this larger field of connectedness, which really helps us deal with it.
Thank you for breaking that down. I work a lot with people who have been in some extremely abusive and traumatic relationships. I imagine that they're listening to you speak, and some of them may still be in that abusive environment.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, for someone who's actively kind of being oppressed, and being sort of told these things and being stripped of their identity and sort of, having to cater. I'm wondering how this would work for someone.
And not only in relationships, culturally, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Based on your, one of your identities, so many identities are oppressed that also comes up. Well, and so that's what led to my more recent work on fierce self-compassion. So there's really two different sides of compassion, sides of love, you might say, sides of care. One is tender and one is fierce. So the tender self-compassion is all about acceptance. We can accept ourselves as we are unconditionally. We can accept the fact that, things are difficult. It's almost like an ideally compassionate parent toward their child. Your baby may be crying or something. We just love that child regardless. We soothe that child. We're there for that child. And eventually the child feels safe and starts to, again, this is ideal, starts to calm down, starts to heal. Very important aspect of self-compassion. But although we want to accept ourselves unconditionally, we don't want to necessarily accept all our behaviors unconditionally if they're causing harm to ourselves or others. And we definitely don't want to accept all our situations unconditionally if they're causing harm to self or others. And so the other side so there's the accepting side of compassion, but there's also the fierce action-oriented side of self-compassion. And I think of this as mama bear self-compassion, right? So the parent may be, unconditionally loving toward their child, but if anyone threatens that child, and I think regardless of gender identity, everyone has this inner mama bear, this protective instinct. It's like rising up and saying, you aren't going to harm what I love. And so part of caring for ourselves also means standing up for ourselves, saying no, fighting for social justice, fighting for human rights. So here's the thing. So if you're in an abusive relationship, you really need both. I mean, the whole thing is balance. It's like yin and yang. We need both the tender and the fierce in balance to be whole. So there's the part of being in an abusive relationship, which is caring for yourself, knowing that your needs count, that you're important, trying to be with the pain of it.
Yes.
But also a really important part of it, when it's safe, when you're ready, with help, all those things go into it. I'm realizing that it's not self-compassionate to stay in a situation that's harmful to you, and so that ability to, speak up, stand up for yourself, to own your anger. Anger, believe it or not, I believe is a part of self-compassion. Anger is it's again a natural protective emotion. It's saying, hey, something's wrong. This is unfair. This is harming me. It just arises up naturally. Again, that's that mama bear energy, arises up naturally to say, hey, there's a problem. We got to do something about this.
Yes.
It makes us brave. It helps us focus on the situation. Now, of course, anger can cause harm. What's the difference between helpful and harmful anger? Pretty simple. Helpful anger allows you to protect yourself from harm or protect others from harm. Unhelpful anger is the stuff that causes harm. And by the way, I say that so easily as if it's easy to do. It's actually easier to understand than it is to do.
Right.
But there's a place for anger, especially when it comes from injustice, right? Or being harmed in some way. And so for a lot of people, and so there's actually been some research on, a colleague of mine did some research on women who had been in abusive relationships, teaching them self-compassion. And one of the things she found is that women felt more empowered afterward. It's like, no, my needs count too. I can stand up for myself. Mm-hmm. And again, I want to couch this in the larger thing of wisdom. How you do that, you need to be safe, right? So like a lot of women, what we know is when they decide to leave that often the violence occurs. So you have to do this with wisdom, with care. You got to care for yourself, with help, all those things. I'm not denying all that. But that internal sense of, I deserve to be treated differently, Unfortunately, what happens for a lot of people, and again, this is like, you can think of a woman in a relationship, you could think of like historically women being internalizing all these messages, the racial messages, the social class messages, people who are oppressed, just to get along in the world, often kind of tend to internalize these messages that somehow, not all, but most of it happens at the unconscious level. I'm sure you know all about implicit bias and all these.
Yes.
People who are oppressed have them just as strongly as the oppressors. And so what fierce self-compassion does is, again, regardless of what you do, which may be more complex in terms of how you get yourself out of an oppressive situation, just knowing, I can see as I'm talking about this, my back is held stronger, higher, that kind of sense of, I am worthy, I deserve to be, it's this my human right to be treated with fairness and respect and not to be harmed. And that's really important part of self-compassion. It's not just, sometimes it's like, no, we really need both.
So even if you're doing it internally, which is what you're saying, like a lot of it is just more of the internal work to kind of get the, and that may help you to sort of get some momentum going.
Yeah. It's both, it's internal and external, but, I don't want to give the message to a woman or a person, it doesn't have to be a woman, someone in an abusive relationship, that I don't want people to start like shaming themselves because they aren't standing up for themselves.
Absolutely.
It's complicated, it's complex. Often children are, there's a lot of complexity, as you know, as a therapist. And again, we need a lot of wisdom in terms of how to navigate challenging situations. So just to honor that complexity. Yes. But what the compassion does is it really, it validates the fact that our needs count. In many ways, self-compassion is asking, what do I need? And, a lot of us are told, so women, if you look at what people are, and by the way, when I say women, I'm not saying biological sex, I'm talking about individuals who are socialized as women, right? Just to talk about the culture. We're taught that our needs aren't as important, that our value comes from meeting the needs of others. So for instance, people who it's not people who identify as women, it's people who are raised as women, because you might be a transgender woman and ironically you were socialized as a man, so it doesn't apply the same way to you. So people who are socialized as women have less self-compassion than people socialized as men, but they have more compassion to others. So the discrepancy, because of how we're raised, is larger. Right? Because our worth comes from helping others and we feel, we're less worthy of meeting our own needs. And that leads to things like, if you look at the statistics, the fact that women do most of the housework, even if they're working, they still do most of the childcare and elder care, even, regardless of the financial situation. That's just the socialization process.
So we're socialized.
You need to highlight that because, we need to also realize that we're as worthy as anyone else, everyone is equally deserving of compassion and getting their needs met.
So part of what I'm hearing you say is some of why we're not self-compassionate, or one of the main reasons why, especially women or um, people who are socialized as women
Yeah,
don't have self-compassion, is because there's sort of this societal expectation,
yeah.
grooming, if you will. Um,
Well, and also, I mean, I'm sorry, but who is that convenient for? I mean, that
yeah.
really upholds the patriarchy, right? Because if people, some class of people are told that their needs are less important and their value comes from meeting the needs of, husbands and children. Well, that's, it's not accidental, put it that way, that this evolved. It's not just biology. There may be some biological component, but it also really helps maintain the social structure. I mean, that's why self-compassion, it's not just about psychological being, it's also about like social justice. It's also about change. It's also about fairness. If you really start looking at it,
Mhm.
the reason I wrote my book, Fierce Self-Compassion, for women, only not that men don't need it, or people socialized as men don't need it as well, but it was just too complicated to say, because people are socialized as men, they are equally harmed
Mhm.
by the gendering, but they're harmed by the fact that they're bullied often for being too sensitive. And so, even though this ability to tend to our own wounds, so to speak, to be emotionally compassionate is really, really important for psychological health. If you're bullied out of that, you don't have access to that resource. So it really harms everyone. But I focused on women because it was just easier to focus on one side of the block. But it really was inspired for me by the Me Too movement. And I realized from my point of view that the Me Too movement was kind of the rising up of women saying, "That's mama bear, we aren't going to take it anymore." That's an act of love. That's an act of compassion, so yeah, it's kind of fun because when I was in graduate school, I was really interested in social justice questions and gender and race and oppression and all that. And then I got into the self-compassion world, that it was more about like emotional healing. And now the two have come together.
They
It's so
intersect.
exciting for me because it's all connected.
I love
It's all about love. It's all about justice. It's all about well-being. Yeah.
I can appreciate you saying that. One of the things that really struck me in your book is you talk about self-esteem,
Yes. Yeah.
and you say we should opt out of the self-esteem game.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's this notion that in order for you to be treated well, you have to have high self-esteem, or you have to have, in order for you to really have a positive experience in life, you
Yes.
have to have high self-esteem. And you
Yeah.
disagree with that.
Well, yeah, it was a little complicated in that you really have to have a sense of self-worth. Okay, so self-worth means I'm worthy, my feelings are worthy, my needs are worthy. So self-esteem most typically is an external source of self-worth. It comes from being special and above average, right? If I say, Natalie, your podcast, yeah, it's average, you'd probably feel like, ooh, little sting. If you told me, Kristen, your writings, I'd feel a sting. So it comes from being special and above average, which means it's comparative.
Yeah.
Which means that kind of disconnects us. If I need to somehow feel a little bit more special or better than someone else, that disconnects us. So that's a problem. Some people get their sense of self-worth by being narcissistic, like really ego defensive. They can't accept any critical feedback, or they blind themselves to the truth to protect their ego as a source of maintaining the high self-esteem. Or it's contingent. So for most people, it's contingent on things like how attractive I think I am, how popular, how much do people like me,
Yeah.
and how successful I am at whatever is important to me. And the problem with that, of course, is that it's contingent. So sometimes people like us and we succeed and we look the way we want to look, and sometimes we don't. And so it's conditional. So what self-compassion is also a sense of self-worth. We need to feel worthy, but it's not conditional. It's unconditional. You might say self-esteem is a fair weather friend. It's just there for us the good times. Self-compassion is like an unconditional friend. It's there for you when you fall down, which is when you need the friend the most, by the way. So that's the difference. So it's not that self-esteem is bad, it's actually good, but we want to get a stable, unconditional source of self-worth, not this conditional comparative source of self-worth.
I like that. If someone's listening to you, how would someone know that they are struggling with self-compassion?
Yeah, so it's really a really easy way to tell is, and I often open my workshops this way. You just write down, think of some times when you had a good friend, someone you cared about, come to you who was struggling. Maybe they were feeling bad about themselves, or maybe they had something really challenging in their life. Write down how you usually relate to that friend. Like what types of things do you say? Maybe what physical gestures do you use? And then that's pretty easily accessible. And then you just ask the same question, well, what about yourself? Think about sometimes recently when you felt bad about yourself or you were struggling in some way. How do you relate to yourself? And for people who struggle with self-compassion, it's abundantly clear because it's radically different, right? And actually, most people are a lot more compassionate to others than they are to themselves. The people who are higher in self-compassion tend to be kind and supportive to both themselves and others. So that's really the easiest way to tell.
With people who struggle with self-compassion, I imagine part of the work is the internal work. That's the big part of the work.
Yeah.
However, again, with people that have had systemic issues with being abused and oppressed,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are tips and suggestions of how they can find other people who are self-compassionate.
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. So the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, which is the nonprofit I founded with my colleague, Chris Germer, we created this 8-week mindful self-compassion program. We're really doing a lot of teaching with affinity groups. It really helps to have people who you might say share your particular flavor of suffering, to just talk about this stuff with. Like it's different whether it's race or gender, or sexual orientation or ability, right? Now it's interesting because they haven't taken off. I was hoping they would. I think, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I do think it helps. So the sense of common humanity, it can be different. Like, if you're the only person of color in a room full of white people, it's a little harder to feel that common humanity just because of these externals. So being with a group of people who share, again, your type of suffering, can I think help engender that remind you, yeah, I'm not alone. So that's one way to do it. If you aren't able to practice with a group of people who share your form of suffering, just mentally remembering, it's one way to do it, just to really, just remember, think of all the people who are in the same situation you're in. Because remember, the feeling that we're alone is actually not a logical conclusion. It's an irrational feeling. We feel like we're all alone, but if we think about it,
it's not.
We aren't, right? Right. And so that's one way to do it, just to really remind yourself, just, actually, I'm not alone. And again, even if, so there's a part of not being alone, like people in the same situation I'm in, and that's helpful. There's also that I'm not alone in that I'm a human being, which is kind of a broader sense. And it's funny, people really, this thing of common humanity is tricky because there's a lot of ways it can work or not work for you. So I just say, try out what works for you. What helps you feel like you belong? Sometimes it's like other people are like me in my same situation. Sometimes it's I'm a flawed human being like everyone else. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. So you just kind of got to have to try it. But so, for instance, going back to your population, and I should also say one thing about people who've suffered trauma is, it's often, I don't need to tell you, it's often a cycle, right? So often people who find themselves in abusive adult relationships had abusive childhoods. Very, very, very common. Yeah. So what we know from the research is that people who had early childhood trauma, is actually really challenging to practice self-compassion. Because what happens is, we've got the threat system and we've got the care system. The threat system, the fight, flight, or freeze response is designed to, try to keep us safe when we're in danger. The care system is when people care for us and we want to be near them, so we feel safe. What happens with an abuse situation is that the signals kind of get mixed. And compassion itself can be scary, right? Because the people who are supposed to give you that feeling of safety didn't. They gave you that feeling of threat. And so there's a lot of reasons it's challenging. A lot of people internalize. So you have to internalize when you're a child that your parents know what they're talking about, because you have to trust your parents because you're dependent on them for everything. So people internalize the belief that there's something wrong with me, somehow I deserve this. And then what happens is a phenomenon we like to call backdraft. It's like, when your house is on fire and you fling open the doors, the air rushes in and the flames rush out. Well, so a lot of people, we just had to shut down our hearts just to survive, just to get through the day.
Yes.
We start opening up the doors of our hearts and all the pain rushes out. And also, when we give ourselves unconditional love, we immediately become aware of all the conditions under which we were unloved. That's just kind of natural, right? So it's called backdraft. It's normal. It's actually a good sign. It's part of the healing process because it means you are opening the door of your heart. The good news is that what we know is even people from like a really pretty bad complex trauma can use self-compassion as a way to heal, because what you're doing is you're learning to give yourself what you didn't get from your parents or from other people. You're learning to meet your own needs. You're learning to feel safety and security with yourself. Having said that, it can be a bumpy ride, and we really recommend, some therapists like you holding someone helping you through. And also sometimes you don't want to practice self-compassion like mental training. If you're feeling so much backdraft that you're disassociating or flooded with traumatic memories, just something like, okay, I'm going to pour myself a cup of tea, and I'm going to pour myself this cup of tea because I'm worthy of this kind act. That's self-compassion. It doesn't have to be complex mental training. It's really just the attitude of trying to meet your own needs.
I like that. I like that. Yeah, because I think there's a lot of people that may be listening to this, or some people that may be listening to it and be like, I don't know where to start.
Yeah.
Or it may seem like sometimes when as I'm sure you, and I don't know if you've experienced this or not, when you're talking about mindfulness and you're talking about sort of doing things for yourself, people's immediate reaction may be that's selfish, or that is for someone who has privilege to do that, and I don't have that. And I would imagine that it takes small micro steps to get to the bigger picture for what you're saying. But I think if we could break it down, I like that you could break it down in such a way that it's relatable for people that are in these situations, and it could be a tough thing.
Yeah, and really just small steps, right?
Yeah.
Small steps. We say walk slowly, go farther. Just small steps. There's some misconceptions people have about self-compassion, which are kind of just worth clearing them up.
Yes.
So first of all, it doesn't take any time. People think I don't have time for self-compassion. Well, actually, you don't have time not to have self-compassion.
Yeah.
So the thought is self-criticism, shame, that all takes time.
Yeah.
Right. So when you're struggling and being supportive to yourself, wow, I'm struggling. This is really hard. Okay, well, I'm just going to do the best I can. It doesn't take time. It's just really a mindset.
Absolutely.
So it's different than self-care.
Yes.
Self-care is behavior, like get a massage, do yoga.
Yeah.
Some people actually don't have time to do that. Maybe you're working 2 jobs to feed your kids. But it's really just the attitude of warmth and support and friendliness.
Absolutely.
And also the thing is, it's selfish, right? It's actually not, because the more compassion flows inward, the more we have available to flow outward, right? And so you're less likely to burn out in caring for others if you care for yourself. And you kind of emotionally validate the pain, the burnout, the overwhelm of caring for others. It helps give you energy. It helps, again, it reduces burnout. And also, we affect each other. You affect me, I affect you. Like right now, you and I are resonating, parents and kids resonate, coworkers resonate. So if you're full of kind of shame or just frustration or burnout, well, then every person you're in contact with that's with who they're resonating with. But if you're like, hey, I'm doing the best I can, I'm just going to try to be friendly and supportive and encouraging to myself. Doesn't mean I'm going to let myself get away with bad behavior, because that's not compassionate. But I'm going to try to encourage, kind of constructively, do the best I can. That every single person you come in contact with comes in contact with like a calmer, more open-hearted person. So that's actually not selfish, it's giving to others. So it's not like we've got 5 units of compassion, and if I give 3 to myself, I only have 2 left over for you. It's actually additive, which is the good news.
I like that. Thank you. E, do you have any thoughts as to why people may be more self-compassionate towards others?
Yeah.
For example, I'm sure you've heard of like bystander, apathy, where people just sort of watch other people sort of get ganged up on or go through things, and or even certain instances where people may become aware of abuse and they have more sympathy for the abuser than for the victims. I hope that makes sense the way that I'm.
Yeah. No, I mean, from my understanding of that literature, and I'm not an expert in this field, a lot of it is due to kind of cognitive confusion. So for instance, the bystander effect.
Yeah.
It's not so much that people don't care, but like if it's clear that you are the only one who's available to help, usually people do step in. So the bystander effect is kind of like, whose responsibility is it? And I'm kind of confused, and is this dangerous? So a lot of it is just kind of cognitive confusion that arises. Also, in terms of like turning away from abuse, and this is one of the things that got me to write my book, is the Me Too movement. A lot of it, again, is cognitive dissonance, which you probably know about, right? So cognitive dissonance means it's just so upsetting to see the truth that we don't see the truth because it's kind of easier to process. And so it's almost like we just turn away. It's not like we're saying, oh yeah, that's great. It's not that. We're just turning away because it's like too difficult to face it. Again, that's why we need the strength of compassion to help give us the strength to face the truth. It's easier to turn away because we don't have to deal with the pain of it. We need a lot of self-compassion to deal with the pain of facing the truth. I mean, talk about pain. If you really open up to what's happening, it's like, it feels totally overwhelming.
Yeah. And
so you need a lot of compassion and strength. And yes, this is hard, and I'm here for you, to be able to turn toward it. So I think that's kind of a lot of what's happening. You had said something, about why people are naturally more compassionate to others than themselves, which is a slightly different question.
Right.
A lot of that's just, some of that's cultural. Were you raised to be compassionate to yourself? No, you were raised to be compassionate. If you're like me, you're probably raised to be compassionate to others, right?
Yeah.
Culture tells us it's weak, we're going to lose our motivation, it's selfish. All these are untrue, but culture tells us that. But it's more than culture. There's also some evolutionary roots to this. So again, we don't want to beat ourselves up for beating ourselves up. In a way, it's natural. Because again, we have these 2 main systems. There's others, but we've got the threat defense system, which is how we deal with personal threats. We go fight, or freeze. And when the problem is ourselves, like we made a mistake or something, we fight ourselves, thinking that we're going to get ourselves in line, so we'll be safe. We won't do the same thing again, or we're going to beat others to the punch. I'm going to beat myself up to keep myself from being beat up from others. We flee into shame. We hang our head in shame. It's a sense of isolating ourselves from the judgment of others. That's also a natural response. Or we freeze. It's like, we just freeze during the headlights. We go around and around in our heads with the negative thought, because it's like, well, I can't move because I'm just immobilized. Now, when your good friend tells you, I just had this horrible thing at work, you aren't so personally threatened. So you don't go into fight, flight, or freeze. You go in the tend and befriend response, right, which actually evolved for other people. It evolved for our children and our group members. Unfortunately, not the whole entire world. That's why compassion can tend to be limited. But it evolved for our group members, people we care about, for group cohesion. And so that, if we cared about our babies, they passed on their genes, et cetera. So we have to do a hack. right? We're actually tapping into a system that evolved to care for others, and we're doing a U-turn and we're using it with ourselves. So it's not entirely natural. That's why it feels a little weird and uncomfortable at first. The good thing is the body doesn't really know the difference. The mind doesn't really know the difference. It takes a little intentionality, but we don't actually have to learn a new skill. We just have to use the skill we naturally have for others and turn it inward. I think that's partly what's going on.
Any ideas how the self-compassion can be increased on a societal level?
Yeah, well, so in some ways it's kind of been my mission a little bit. Like, it has made a difference. So when I started 20 years ago, no one even used the word self-compassion. And now it's kind of in common parlance. People use the word, but I think people kind of have some idea of what it means. The science has made a big difference. There's over 4,000 research studies now showing the benefits of self-compassion, and at least in Western culture, that gets people to listen if they know there's scientific empirical evidence for its benefits. But a lot of it is up to us. So for instance, there's this great research study that says self-compassion is contagious. So if we model self-compassion out loud, people start becoming more self-compassionate. Right. So usually what we do is we model self-criticism out loud, hoping that other people will give us compassion. If I say, oh, I'm so stupid, we're hoping they'll say, oh, no, you aren't. You're doing the best you can. And so when we do that, we get a little compassion, but we're also modeling for that person. The good way to respond is to say, oh, I'm so stupid. But if you model, that was painful. I feel badly about that mistake. Oh, well, I was doing the best I can. Then you're actually modeling self-compassion. So what we say out loud or to others or our children or our friends, it does have ripple effects.
I agree. I do think a large part of it is modeling. But I also think there's also like this sort of attraction to certain things or populations. For example, like, I talk a little bit about animals because prior to working with people, I did work with animals. And with abused animals, there's so much outpouring and support. You don't really have to sort of sell or model as much, if you will. It just seems to be like, this is what we have to do. You don't even have to really sort of ask. There's just sort of this outpouring of that. And historically over time, it hasn't really changed, because if you think about it, the American Humane Society is the one who, and I'm not sure if you know it, but they did all of the human rights activists because the movement was for animals first. And so when I think of things like that, I'm like, oh, people just always have for, long periods of time just sort of been compassionate towards animals and will give their life to kind of rescue, save, and do all of these things. How can we sort of mirror or emulate that for society on a broader scale?
I've never thought of that. That sounds like a great idea. No, that makes sense to me. Maybe because again, it comes so naturally. Thinking somehow. Any other good ideas? I want to listen to you. You probably thought about this. I love that. So animals. I'm serious. Do you have any other ideas on how to spread self-compassion?
I don't know that I necessarily off the top of my head, but that was just always so curious to me that's, just people will be very compassionate about their animals, even people who struggle with very challenging mental illnesses or suicidal ideation, the love for the animal.
It's interesting. So Chris Germer, I'm not a clinician, but Chris Germer is, and he said he had one client who his backdraft, he was severe complex trauma. Just the idea of giving himself compassion would bring up all this fear, and he couldn't do it, but he could pet his cat. He loved his cat. He cared for his cat. And so kind of the way you might say he cared for himself was by having that physical contact with his cat. So yeah, no, and I think there's some research actually saying that people with support animals, it can with dogs can help them increase self-compassion. So yeah, no, I think you're onto something there. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways through.
Yeah.
But and so that's the thing about self-compassion is we aren't really learning a new skill. We're learning the skill we already have for our friends, for our loved ones, for our animals, which are often the most easy, uncomplicated, compassionate relationship we have in our lives. And we can use that as kind of a, a way to model what does it look like. People say, I don't know what self-compassion feels like. But you know what compassion feels like? Most people, not everyone, but unless you're, got a serious mental illness, you probably have some experience of compassion with others. And you can use that, with yourself. You have a template, which is the good news. Again, we aren't inventing something new.
I like that. Yeah. And I definitely think it might just warrant just even looking closer at it. There's so many ways that it can improve. And I like the fact that you say, as you say, it's contagious.
It is. Yeah.
Right now, out in the world, we're in the midst of a challenging time.
You think? That's an understatement of the year.
We have a lot of challenging things going
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And, and maybe this might be a tall order question for you, but just something that I've thought about when it comes to people in leadership who make decisions like Roe versus Wade or, any of the other policies around violence or, even sentencing or just in general how people should live their lives, as you see these things and as you see I feel like people today are very much so on edge, just from all of the decisions and just violence and things like that it just things
not to mention COVID,
inflation, everything
cherry on top.
yeah. So I'm just wondering, when it comes to, self-compassion and maybe, policies around how people can be treated fairly and equitably. And maybe again, that's a tall order, but any ideas that perhaps you may have had around, leadership or other people that are kind of at the top of the at the top of all the decision making that could maybe help people coexist better. Because I do think, like you were saying, a large part of it is modeling, right? And culture. But especially in US based culture, when we talk about leadership, that's not always modeled so well.
Yeah. I mean, it's how to get our leaders to be more I'd settle for compassion, let alone self-compassion. It is obviously a huge question. I do think that's one of the reasons, like I say, I've been focusing more on fierce self-compassion, because it's not enough for us to sit on our cushion or at home and be well and happy. The world, because it affects us, right? So what's happening externally also impacts us internally. And I think we do need to take action. We do. So like a friend of mine, for instance, just formed the Compassion Coalition. So all these compassion organizations, we're going to try to channel this into taking some sort of political action. We do need to be involved in the world. A lot of humility and kind of a lot of grief involved. So if you do believe in social justice or trying to make changes, it's overwhelming. It's like, it's a mountain. It feels so almost hopeless. So you do need a lot of compassion just to kind of, I'm just going to do my best. It does seem overwhelming. But, who knows? I mean, we just have to do what we can, right? So I think the more it's talked about, here's the good thing about self-compassion and compassion is it works. It's actually effective. And so for leaders like to be effective, you know, so maybe through the research or just if they're willing to try it and they realize that this more compassionate stance actually gets better results, that might hopefully make some change. You know, it's, I just think we have to just do what we can day by day, try not to give up hope, you know, but also recognize we aren't in control. It's much bigger than us. So we just do our best and try to change what we can, but not give up either, because that's not self-compassionate, right? So if we don't try to fight for justice and fairness and the end of oppression and politics and all that, then we're also kind of harming ourselves, right? It's this matter of balance. It really is yin and yang, the acceptance and the change, the action and the kind of, you know, peacefulness. It's both. And we always need both. We always need to try to be in balance as much as possible.
I like that. Thank you.
I didn't really answer your question, but
it's a big question.
I don't know. I mean, obviously it's above my pay grade to answer that one.
Oh yeah, but you know, and I get that it is a big question, but and maybe it's just more of a thought-provoking question to really, you know, do it on a larger scale.
It really is so important to be asking those questions.
Yeah.
And not just because they can't be answered doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking them.
Absolutely.
I totally get you.
I appreciate you being willing to do
that. Yeah.
So we're at the end, Dr. Neff. So for people that want to connect with you, can you let us know where you can be reached?
Yes, it's very easy. If you go to selfcompassion.org, or if you just Google self-compassion, you'll find me. And I've got a lot of free accessible materials. If you're into research, I've got like hundreds and hundreds of research articles. The self-compassion scale, you can test your own self-compassion level and see if you think it's something you'd like to work on. I have lots of practices like guided meditations or little short practices you can do. Got information, and I also have links to places where you could get more training, like the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, if you want to take it further. So that's probably the good place to start.
Okay. Anything that you are working on that we can support you with, or anything that's coming up, any new projects or anything like that?
Well, currently it's exciting. So I published the book Fierce Self-Compassion last year. It came out last summer. And now we're working on an 8-week training course in Fierce Self-Compassion as a follow-up to the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which is kind of the basics of self-compassion. And in a way, Fierce Self-Compassion is a little more, it's good to have the basics in place before you start like doing things like drawing boundaries or things like that. So that's what I'm working on now. So
absolutely. And I'll be sure to link your book in the show notes there, your self-compassion book, so people can find all of that information as well as your website in the show notes as well.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you. And I appreciate so much your wonderful wisdom and insight on the show, Dr. Neff.
Well, I appreciate it. It was a great interview. You're very insightful interviewer. I like that.
Okay, so you've heard the gems that Dr. Neff had to drop. Want to know what your thoughts are about this show, what you learned from Dr. Neff, and if you've been incorporating self-compassion into your life, and how has that been for you? You know, can you relate to what she's saying? Is it something that you need to be doing more of? Let's talk about it. And you guys know where to find me. Definitely hit those social media channels to keep the conversation going. If you want to write to the email, that's great too. And until next time, you guys, stay safe and be well. Check out the sneak preview of next week's episode.
Yeah, so let's do the clinician part first. So we'll talk shop for a second. Yeah. So if there's a pattern, the first place we look is inside. So, and every now and then I have someone say, stop blaming me. I'm like, I'm not blaming. And I tell them, I say, you want the problem to be with you, because if it's with you, you can change it and fix it. If it's not with you, I said, then the universe is against you. So you really do want the problem to be within you. We have control over that. Yeah. And so when what you said is a good point of if there's a pattern of it, if there's a habit of it. Well, patterns don't lie. We may not like it, and we may not know the exact interpretation, but there's a pattern there, and something's getting in the way. And it can be, I'm more looking for the specific things, or what are they doing? Sometimes it's picking guys that are unavailable. Sometimes it's overgiving. Sometimes it's being rigid. Now, this is purely anecdotal, I'm about to say. It's purely anecdotal, so all the research on it. At least what I've seen over the years is women, there's like two major fears.